of Marine Sciences in the School of Marine Sciences at University of Maine. She is also the director of the Maine Sea Grant College Program. She has more than 20 years of academic experience as a researcher and faculty member at UMaine, Washington State University, and University of Massachusetts. She also served as the supervisory fishery biologist at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in Longview, Washington. She currently serves on the Maine Ocean School Board of Trustees and is on the Wells RMA Board, the Fishermen Forum Board, and the University of Maine President's Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Her research seeks to understand the impacts of environmental conditions on fish behavior, physiology, and their relationship with population dynamics. For more than a decade, she has had a research focus on short-nosed and Atlantic sturgeon in the Penobscot River and the broader Gulf of Maine, studying their behavior and population dynamics. She also leads a research program focused on the environmental effects of tidal power development in partnership with state and national natural resource regulators and marine renewable energy industry partners in the US and in Canada. Dr. Zydlewski, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you, Ruth, and all of the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust folks for inviting me to come, and all of you for being here tonight. I have to admit, I've never given a sturgeon lecture from a room in my home before, so I'm excited about doing that, and amazed to see you all here and that you're as excited about sturgeon as I am. So fortunately, Becky and Ruth forwarded the questions that you put in with your registration to me. So I'm hoping that I can hit on many of them as I go through kind of a lecture format here, but I feel free to, and people are putting questions in the chat. That's great. And hopefully I can pause along the way. I don't want to lose you or bore you along the way. So feel free to, tell me to stop, and I'm happy to do so. So I'll be talking with you about Sturgeon of Maine. As Becky indicated, a lot of the work that where I started with this is in the Penobscot River. But what you'll find out is that there are many connections of the sturgeon among all of the rivers of Maine, and I'll touch on where we've been finding them and how we get to do the work and some of the answers to the questions that you've brought up. So I want to make sure that everybody is okay. If anybody has any problems hearing me, I can speak up. So just type in the chat, speak up. But I want to make sure I can share all of this with you. I'll just start by saying that the work that I'll be presenting or showing you tonight is kind of a compilation of work that's been done by many graduate students and colleagues. And I'll point out one person who I've worked very closely with on all of this work in the School of Biology and Ecology is Mike Kinnison. And then I'll also point out that work has been done in collaboration with scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey and Department of Marine Resources. And a lot of the funding for the work actually comes from NOAA, the Penobscot River Restoration Trust, and the Nature Conservancy. That said, I'd love to start by providing a little bit of a human perspective on sturgeon. We typically start by thinking, or I do anyway, thinking of sturgeon from our own frame, what we've experienced and know. And I show you here my perspective, working with a close colleague to better understand an endangered species. So, and I should point out that both species that we'll be talking about today are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And that has implications to the questions that are coming in around caviar and harvest and those types of things that we can get into. But what I'd like to do is take a little more holistic perspective of the times when the species were more abundant and commercially fished in the backyards of some of you that you may remember. For example, there's a picture of sturgeon caught in Merry Mating Bay at a time when commercial fishing was acceptable for, this is an Atlantic sturgeon species shown here. However, I also want to challenge us to try to take the perspective of the people who have stewarded the lands of Maine for thousands of years the people of the Wabanaki Confederacy who continue stewarding these lands and the deep connections to the water and all those connected to it. Sturgeon were and are an integral piece of their spiritual connection to these lands. And I want to acknowledge that connection and use one place that some of you may be familiar with near a town we call Belfast to illustrate that connection. Some of you may have driven over the bridge of the stream that's really hard to pronounce, the Pisagassawakeg. And I don't know if anybody, maybe you can stick it in the chat, but that is a Native American term for a place for spearing sturgeon by torchlight. So right in the words of the Native American people are a reverence for sturgeon. So I want to acknowledge that, but I personally can't begin to really appreciate what that was like and the disconnect that the Wabanaki people feel with the loss of resources like sturgeon to their communities. So I just want to call that out as I begin this presentation. And before I leave this slide, I'll also just mention that there are current archaeological studies suggesting that sturgeon movements along the coast of Maine were existent for over 3,000 years at least. So the aging of some of the structures that have been found in the shell middens, that you can actually go to the Maine Historic Preservation Commission site, and through the work of Art Spies and David Hollowell, they've been looking at the contents of shell middens along the coast of Maine, and they have scutes. So the hard structures that are found on sturgeon that I'll show you some pictures of in a little bit, but an example is shown here. This scute in particular was aged to be 3,000 years old, taken from the Winslow-Sebasticook confluence. So it's a scute from a sturgeon that's been aged back to that time. So I just want to think about that. If you can kind of grasp the idea that these, you go 3,000 years, but we can even go back further. And some of you pointed out in your questions, you know, how prehistoric are sturgeon? And this is kind of an interesting and fun cartoon to just show that sturgeon were around during the time of the dinosaurs. So if we actually look at time way back, what we found over time is that the sturgeon family was known to exist approximately 200 million years ago. So this diagram, this spiral diagram on the right-hand side of your screen is actually a depiction of life on Earth. And if we think about that time frame and kind of move forward, it's 200 million years ago when we first start seeing sturgeon, about 70 million years ago when somehow I got muted, hopefully not too long ago. So stepping through 65 million years ago is when we lost the dinosaurs. So what you see here in this red line is approximately how far back, and kind of a little depiction there of the types of other animals that were around at that time, or the time when sturgeon really became present on Earth. And we start thinking, and someone asked the question of historically or in this time frame, like where does that fall with other fishes? And this depiction that you see here is just another way of looking at the diagram on the right. If you look on the right-hand side of that graphic, it just shows millions of years ago. So you can see where 200 million years ago would be. It's kind of on that narrow part of between the Triassic and the Jurassic, where ray-finned fishes are actually starting to become more and more present and more abundant. And it's this kind of wide part of the screen is where you start seeing species like striped bass. So sturgeon are pretty, they evolved quite a long time ago, and they're an interesting species to think about, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But just kind of bring up some photos because these animals are incredible, and I hope that some of you have had a chance to see them up close, but I'll try to show you some photos here so you can see some details. And this is the picture, actually all of these pictures are pictures of short-nosed sturgeon, but it's fun to look at them, and just if you stare at them hard enough, you can see the details, the shapes, the diamond shapes. Those are hard structures that we call scutes. They're much like the protective plates that we saw in many of the dinosaurs. So these are they armor the fish. And if you kind of look closely along the head structure, you can see some of the interesting patterns. And if we start looking at this closely and look at some of the fossil records that are used to try to understand the species, we sometimes call sturgeon and other fish species living fossils. And there's a reason for this. It's not that they look exactly like they did back in the day when they first started being present on Earth, but they don't look that different. There hasn't been huge changes to their morphological features. So the picture on the bottom right is the head of the sturgeon that I just showed you. The picture on the upper left is a fossil remain from the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago. So if you look at those two different pictures, you start seeing some similarities of the structures. And I have a couple more photos just to kind of demonstrate that. But if you look at this top picture on the right, you can see that the scutes, how similar they are relative to the skull that you see in a fish that I took a picture of. So it's amazing when you hear someone maybe say, oh, that's a living fossil. This is one of the reasons. And there's definitely some literature out there on debating whether or not they're really a living fossil and what that means, but it's fun to think about it from the perspective of how long they've been here on Earth. So I'm going to keep going and give you some other outside perspective before I get to Maine, and just kind of give you an idea of where we find sturgeon around the globe. So if you look at this picture, you see the Tropic of Cancer there, and you see a bunch of circles, one NEP and then a GL, and I'll circle this one. So this is in the Northwest Atlantic. So all of these areas that are circled are places where you find sturgeon. And one of the things that you'll notice is I'm not showing you the Southern Hemisphere at all. So sturgeon are only found in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's kind of an interesting evolutionary past for the sturgeon that we won't get into, but I thought before we move to talking about our neck of the woods in North America, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a perspective. This is just flipping at the map and looking down on the North Pole. So to the left or to the right-hand side of that slide, you can see the Eurasian areas. And some of I just want to kind of give you some interesting tidbits about sturgeon in other places. And these are just photos of a Kaluga sturgeon in Japan, a Chinese sturgeon in the Yangtze River, a beluga sturgeon in the Black Sea, one of the largest sturgeons that there is out there. So these are fascinating. And I bring this up because one of the things to think about are all of these different species. There's 27 species of sturgeon. 19 of them have been contracting their range, and 63% of those are on the critically endangered species list. So sturgeon themselves as a group are considered to be one of the mostly imperiled species of fish that's out there. So it's just something to keep in mind for all of these species. And really these graphs are just, as you see, at some point, these species, the populations were high and they dropped over time. And currently many of these species are in pretty dire straits. And some of you may notice the paddlefish on the bottom right, very closely related species to the sturgeon. They tend to get clumped with them. So they're an interesting species to talk about. One of the things that was brought up in questions and always comes to mind when you think of sturgeon is caviar. So here's a picture of some sturgeon caviar, and it can be considered for most of these species as one of the reasons why we see many of the declines in these populations, because they're harvested for the caviar in particular. There are some examples of other problems that have, and we'll come back to that at the end, but for species not in Maine, for example, if you think of the Aral Sea, poorly planned irrigation, habitat destruction, that had implications for sturgeon species there. And some of you, if you follow different species of fish, you'll know that population declines aren't unique to sturgeon. So I just bring this up as a reminder that it's a hard time right now to think about all of these different species, but many people are doing a lot of work to try to conserve them. And this is just a diagram of different species on the left-hand side in the Northwest Atlantic and on the right in the Northeast Atlantic, where we see populations of species like shad, herring, eel, striped bass, salmon, all on the decline. So trying to think broadly across these species and what can we do to conserve them. But one of the things that makes sturgeon unique and kind of interesting to consider is this connection to caviar and the size. So actually, I'm going to go back. So this is a great picture of a white sturgeon on the west coast of the United States. It's one of the largest species that we have in North America. And I bring it up here because it's going to fall on this graph in a really interesting spot that I'm going to show you. But it's one of the reasons why, well, number one, the fact that caviar is harvested from them. They're really big, but they have really small eggs. So you get a sturgeon this big that might have eggs in it, you're going to harvest a lot of caviar, a lot of eggs. But being that big is also because if we look on this graph, and I'm going to kind of walk through this slowly here, on the x-axis, what you have is age for a female to become mature, to actually have eggs that can be fertilized. And what you see for this, if we take this white sturgeon, which is this Asapenser transmontanus, this one dot, that's the one dot that's shown out here next to the picture, what you see is that it takes more than 25 years for an individual to become mature. And then if you look at on the other axis, on the y-axis, it's how often they spawn. So not only does it take a long time for a sturgeon to become mature, they don't spawn every year. So it's crucial that they can make it to that large stage of being able to mature, but also they have to be given multiple years to be able to spawn, to actually reproduce for the next generation. So I point on the y-axis here, you see that for some of these different species, they don't spawn, but every 3 to 5 or even 6 years. So that's really a restriction for this species, and it's a unique part of what they are and why they're in the place that they are. So now I'm going to start getting to Maine. And what we see, what I've circled here are the 2 species of interest to us. In the green, and I'm going to use this framework as we, actually, I think I have it backwards in here, but 2 different species. The one that's circled in the green right now is Asapenser brevirostrum. Brevirostrum, for those of you who love Latin, is abbreviated. So it's an abbreviated snout. So that's the short-nosed sturgeon. The Asapenser oxyrhynchus is the Atlantic sturgeon. So those are the 2 species, but of interest on this slide, short-nosed sturgeon are known to not spawn, but every 5 years. And we need to give them more than 5 years to become mature. So there's some interesting ramifications to this for the populations that we can talk about tonight. Here are the different species, sturgeon species of North America, and I won't go through them all. I'll just point out to you the short-nosed and the Atlantic sturgeon that we'll be talking about tonight. There are others in North America. I pointed out or mentioned the white sturgeon to you, shown on the bottom there. But this is definitely, these are the 2 species of interest in the Gulf of Maine, short-nosed and Atlantic. So now we'll move into a tale of 2 sturgeon of Maine. So there are some interesting similarities and there are some interesting differences. And I'm going to go through this, and definitely halt me if I'm not kind of getting to the, if I'm talking about one and you're not sure if I'm talking about which one I'm talking about. And I'm happy to kind of slow down and talk about that in a little bit, or separate them out for you. So one of the questions is, where do they go? And that's a lot of the work, the research that we've been doing over the last decade or so, and folks in various places in the Gulf of Maine who I'll be talking about. But if we start kind of on the, like a salmon, they're considered what we call anadromous. And so if we start with spawning, so I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but they spawn in fresh water. between May and June. Short-nosed tend to spawn earlier in the year, Atlantic sturgeon a little bit later. So they're in the river, in fresh water, at slightly different times, but they're not like a salmon in the sense that salmon go up to very small streams. Sturgeons stay in the larger part of the rivers, typically till they reach the first barrier on the river. The second, so once they're spawned, they stay in the river in rocky bottoms as eggs, and then they stay in the river as juveniles. They spend 1 to 4 years in the river, living in fresh water until, and this is the sizes that are shown here, 1 to 2.5 feet. That's mostly for Atlantic sturgeon. And then they go out to the ocean and spend a lot of their time in the ocean as what we call subadults, so before they actually mature. And then they do come into the estuaries in large concentrations in the summer and fall for some feeding, which we can talk about because somebody asked about that as well. And then they go back out to the ocean in the winter. So that's for Atlantic sturgeon. So this is a photo of an Atlantic sturgeon jumping, and we'll get to that because several people had questions about that, and I still have questions about it myself, but I'm happy to discuss it. For short-nosed sturgeon, it's a little bit different. So here's a photo of a short-nose. Again, I mentioned that they tend to spawn, they come into the rivers, they spawn in large river systems, but they spawn a little bit earlier in the year. And then they are known to go to the estuary, but I have a big X out in the ocean because before our research started, short-nosed sturgeon weren't expected to go out to the ocean at all. They were actually expected, they go up into fresh water, spend time in the estuary, and then move back up into fresh water in the winter to get ready to spawn again in the spring. And what I'll show you in a little bit is some variations on that we've been finding in the Gulf of Maine. But generally those are the patterns that they follow. And I think some people had some questions about, where are they when? And I think somebody even gave a story of when they tend to see them, which is very consistent with what I just kind of went over, but I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more as we move into the next slides. So in terms of studying sturgeon in Maine, the Maine Department of Resources did a lot of work in the 90s. Looking at populations in the Kennebec River, and there have been there's a lot of information out there I could definitely share with you about the work that was done at that time. And the Edwards Dam was then removed in 1999, and further studies happened as well. Around that time, there was also the scientists from Maine DMR did some work in the Penobscot to see if there were any sturgeon. And in the late 80s, they didn't find any. So the sturgeon weren't known to be in the Penobscot until 2005, when a fisherman fishing for striped bass in Brewer, if everybody knows that part of the river, caught a sturgeon and said, caught a sturgeon, but then let it go. And so we didn't know, was it a short nose or an Atlantic? And that began the research at the University of Maine on sturgeon in the Penobscot. It was reported to NOAA and then to us. So we started doing some work in the Penobscot. This is a diagram on the right-hand side of just showing the river, if you can make it out there. And each of those dots that are shown on the river there is one of these, what we call receivers, this black canister that looks like a bomb, but it's actually sits on the bottom of the river and listens for tags. So we would go out in the river, we have been for over a decade now, putting a receiver at each one of these black dots. And then we go out with gill nets and we under an endangered species permit to collect sturgeon and put tags in them. These are the tags that we put in them. They emit a sound that's picked up by these receivers. And for as a fish moves, each tag has an individual number that we can, and my students just fondly name some of the fish based on what they're doing and such, but we have fish that we've tagged and followed them through the river system. And that's where our data are generated. And mostly what I'm going to do now is not kind of go through methods and results, but then take the data that we've been collecting for a few decades and answer some of your questions. So one of the questions always comes up is, how big are they? This picture is not from Maine, but we imagine that we have this size of a fish here. So this is an Atlantic sturgeon collected in New York. And this is one of the larger size Atlantic sturgeon. Atlantic sturgeon can reach 12 feet long and be up to 800 pounds. And they live very long, up to and longer than 50 years, we think. So that's just an example of, we believe there are fish this size in the Kennebec River and perhaps in the Penobscot, but the sizes that we've been collecting, and this is just a diagram again for Atlantic sturgeon, on the x-axis you see size, and there are a whole lot of colors here, but really what I want you to look at, because what everybody wants to know is that big end of the spectrum. So when we go out in the river and we use gill nets that are different size mesh, which means we can only catch fish that are so big. Like if they're bigger and they can't get in the net or stay in the net, it's hard for us to bring them on board. So that's why we haven't caught fish, many fish bigger than 6.5 feet. So the different colors here are just the bars are numbers of fish that were collected in the Penobscot and the Kennebec of using different size nets. So those are the different colors that you see there. I also point this out. So this is for Atlantic sturgeon, and you might say, well, what about short-nosed sturgeon? So here's a diagram and these are data collected in the Penobscot, but they're significantly smaller than an Atlantic sturgeon. So Atlantic sturgeon tend to be larger, short-nosed sturgeon tend to be smaller. Short-nosed kind of cap out at about 4.5 feet long, whereas Atlantics can be much bigger. So that gives you an idea of how big the sturgeon that we see here in the Gulf of Maine are. So somebody asked the question, and you might guess, because I've already alluded to the similarity to salmon, do they migrate? And heck yes, they migrate. Interestingly, when we started our work, I mentioned the Department of Marine Resources was doing work, and the diagram that you see here, you see dots in the Kennebec River. So at the same time when we were putting those receivers in the Penobscot River, DMR was putting receivers in the Kennebec River, but they were putting tags in striped bass. So they were tracking and trying to understand striped bass in the Kennebec. Lo and behold, our tags started showing up. We were tagging sturgeon in the Penobscot, and they started showing up in the Kennebec. So that was interesting. And a couple of other things just to bring up is that, so they detected 2 of our Atlantics and 10 of our short nose in the Kennebec. But when we were catching fish in the Penobscot, we also captured 2 individuals in there that were tagged in the Kennebec 10 years earlier in 1998 and 1999. So there are obviously connections between sturgeon that we're catching in the different river systems of Maine. And that's the basis of a lot of the work that we've been doing at the university and in collaboration with DMR and other researchers in the Gulf of Maine. I'm seeing that the time is almost 6:40, and I do want to maybe pause for a minute and ask Ruth if she thinks that there are questions I should be answering, because I see them coming into the chat box, and I want to be cognizant of that, but also perhaps get through some more of these slides.
Gayle, I might just let you keep going, and then if there are things you don't hit at the end, we can touch back on them at that point. Okay, great.
So some of the questions when we were looking in the Penobscot, again, and some of your questions are, where do they go? So when these are short-nosed sturgeon tagged in the Penobscot, and what we were finding is that in the winter, if you can look at the months down at the bottom here, the bottom of the slide, you see, I circled this section because we take our receivers out of the river. And these bars just are indicating, if you kind of look at it as a wave. So from this part of the river, we see fish in June and July in this lower part of the river, and then they kind of go up to this other higher part of the river. And then in the winter, they stay in that location. And so this gives you an idea, where are they when? Why don't I see them in certain parts of the river? And similar patterns are happen in the Kennebec as well, in different parts. But one of the things that was really interesting to us is, as I told you earlier, when we started this work, we were told short-nosed sturgeon don't migrate in the ocean. And so we were like, okay, we're going to study the river. That makes it simple. We can, launch in Bangor and be able to go down to Verona Island and do all our work in that space. Well, we started seeing a lot of individuals that, when we were tagging them, were leaving. They were going out. That's what that box is circling. They were going somewhere, we didn't know where. But we did start getting the indication from DMR that they were finding them in the Kennebec. So this is just I'll get to the diagram in a minute, but the punchline is 72% of the fish, the short-nosed sturgeon that we were tagging in the Penobscot, were leaving the Penobscot at some point. We were told they weren't supposed to leave at all. And then 90% of those were returning back to the Penobscot. So it's not like the Penobscot isn't important. There's some kind of interesting connection to the Penobscot, between the Penobscot and the Kennebec. But I guess what I'll point out in the diagram that's shown on the left there is, if you look on the side, it says Penn Estuary, that's Penn Estuary, Penobscot Bay. STG is the St. George River. Oops, sorry. Med is the Medomic, Dam is the Damariscotta, and Ken is the Kennebec. And what we were finding is that our fish were showing up in different smaller rivers in between the Penobscot and Kennebec. So they were showing up, for instance, these we called spring immigrants. They left in the spring and they showed up in the Medomic. And then they showed up in the Kennebec, and then on the way back, they might hit one of those smaller rivers on the way back. So this has implications for managing and understanding the populations, because when considering or thinking about sturgeon across the eastern seaboard, people say, oh, they only go in large river systems. But we've been seeing them in smaller river systems. So that's an interesting item to keep in mind when thinking about trying to understand the population as a whole. This is a diagram similar. So on the left is the Penobscot River again, but this is for Atlantic sturgeon. And so what you see here is a diagram of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Atlantic sturgeon that had tags in them. And this is a pattern over 1, 2, 3, 5 or 6 years. And it comes right out, I think. So we have this area of the river that they all go to in the spring and through the summer, and then they leave. And then they come back the following spring, they go to this one part of the river, and then they leave again. And you see that over and over again. And we've seen this with Atlantic sturgeon. The question then becomes, we go back to this life history slide, where are they going in the ocean? So we don't have a very good handle on that right now. And that's one of our big questions for Atlantic sturgeon. What we do know is that those tags that we put in those sturgeon, they're the same system as used in other places. So as I mentioned, we were doing our work in the Penobscot, and DMR was doing their work in the Kennebec using the same receivers. There are these receivers that are used by multiple researchers, and we've started to get indications. These bubbles that are shown on this graph here, these are just for Atlantic sturgeon tagged in the Penobscot. The numbers are shown in the number of detections on the right-hand side. So the bigger the bubble, the more the individuals. So obviously, most of them are showing up in the Gulf of Maine. But what you'll notice is, if you look down here, we have one of our Atlantic sturgeon tagged in the Penobscot showed up in the New York Bight. And then individuals are showing up in the Bay of Fundy. And we're starting to find Atlantic sturgeon from the Bay of Fundy showing up in the Penobscot. So that these animals migrate long distances. This graphic just shows to you the different river systems in Maine, and we've been doing work with USGS scientists studying the Merrimack River, scientists from the University of New England tagging sturgeon in the Saco River. As I mentioned, DMR in the Kennebec. We've been working in the Penobscot, and we have scientists who work with in the St. John's River and up in Acadia University in Canada. And these dots are all places where there are receivers that can listen for the tags, and Atlantic sturgeon have been detected. One of the things that you might see here is that we have no way of detecting what's happening out in the wider Gulf of Maine. So when they disappear, it's hard to know where they're going in the ocean still with these tags, because the receivers that are listening for them aren't really throughout the entire Gulf of Maine. So not too long ago, James Sulikowski, who works worked at University of New England on the Saco River, put some satellite tags on Atlantic sturgeon to see where will those tags pop off. So these tags are made so that you can attach them to the outside of the fish. They pop off, and then they send a signal to a satellite so you can find that tag again, and wherever it popped off is where it is. So you can put it on an individual that's going to leave, and then you can tell it when it should pop off. So he told it pop off in January so that we know in the wintertime where these fish are located. And so he tagged Atlantic sturgeon in the Saco River. We thought they would go well offshore, kind of like this one individual did, and maybe be in a deep section of the Gulf of Maine. Instead, he found that a lot of those individuals just stayed right in Saco Bay, which is interesting. And we're just curious to know, he tagged 6 individuals. So I'll just point out that right now, one of our studies this is an example. This is me holding an Atlantic sturgeon, and here's a satellite tag on it. That's the kind of tag that James used. This is what it looks like when you're putting it on the fish. And so just this last summer, we tagged 10 Atlantic sturgeon in the Penobscot and 20 in the Kennebec. And those tags are starting to pop off now. And we just had one pop off last weekend that we found. Guess where? We tagged the fish in the Penobscot, and it showed up in Saco Bay, right where James's tags were popped off in 2018. So there may be something there that we need to really consider about that area that might be important for Atlantic sturgeon. One of the other questions that a lot of people want to know, but I don't think it was necessarily one of the questions that came in with registration, is how many are there? That was one of our questions. And for short-nosed sturgeon in the Penobscot River, we have some marker capture estimates and I know this is a wide range, but somewhere between 250 and 2,900 individuals. But we have another study where we see somewhere between 500 and 1,100 individuals. Now, the range in those population estimates are because those fish are moving around. So there are times during the year, like in the winter, where we have a tighter population estimate. Roughly speaking, we say in the Penobscot, there's roughly 1,000 short-nosed sturgeon probably inhabiting the Penobscot at this time. In the Kennebec, the most recent estimates are from the late 90s, before the Edwards Dam removal. And the estimate there was nearly 10,000 fish, so 9,500. And so the Kennebec certainly seems to be the center of all things sturgeon. And there are other reasons I say that I'm happy to talk about. This is just another example of an estimate way that we estimate sturgeon presence in the Penobscot using a visual underwater camera. I'm just going to skip that. So for Atlantic sturgeon, it's really hard to estimate them because they move out to the ocean. They're moving between river systems, going to New York, going to Canada. So to get a good population estimate is tough. But so far right now, we have used a population estimate where we think that roughly speaking, maybe there's up to 10,000 Atlantic sturgeon in the Gulf of Maine. And in the Penobscot, there are probably about 700 individuals coming to use the Penobscot. throughout the year. So that's just an idea of numbers. And I guess I should give a shout out to the guys in this in these pictures. These are graduate students who have been working on these projects over the years. So they've been the ones tagging them and really putting the pieces together on these population estimates. Okay, here it is. The question everybody's been waiting for. Why do sturgeon leap? So there's lots of theories on this, and I love to talk about all of them. So one that you hear that people talk about some is that they think that they jump out of the water so that when they hit the water, parasites will be taken off. So the parasites will go away. So you may have heard of that. Another theory is that is communication. So some people think that they jump and when they hit the water, they're all different sizes. So even in this picture, if you look really closely, obviously it's a close-up of a smaller one on the right, but a really big one in the picture on the left, but at a distance. So when they hit the water, they make a different sound, maybe communicating between individuals. That's another theory. One of the theories that seems to be the most possible and people are starting to study is that sturgeon, if anybody has heard of swim bladders in fish, sturgeon have a swim bladder that it connects to their throat and out to their mouth. So the only way to fill their swim bladder is to actually gulp air. Now they can release air from their swim bladder by just burping underwater if they needed to. But in order to get any air into their swim bladder to change their buoyancy underwater, they actually have to gulp air. So some people feel, and you can actually look, and I challenge you all to test this, different times of the tide. As the tide is changing, the pressure on the swim bladder changes, so the volume of air in the swim bladder also changes. So if they want to add air to their swim bladder, they have to leap to get more air into the swim bladder. And interestingly, I've seen a presentation before. There are some scientists who are putting these tags on sturgeon. They're called accelerometer tags. So you can actually see how quickly they're moving, jumping out of the water, and then you can see what depth they end up going to, which seems to be adjusted. Once they start at one depth before they jump, they end up at a different depth afterwards, which is some evidence that they're changing the volume of their swim bladder. So buy it or not, I end on that one because that's the one I believe the most, but they all could have some, some credence to them. Okay, I'm wrapping up here. So some of the biggest threats. So people ask this question, the biggest threats to Atlantic sturgeon in particular are primarily entanglement in fishing gear, habitat degradation, and habitat impediments such as dams, like shown here, and other barriers like dams. And on the right-hand side of the photo there is a sturgeon that was thought to be hit by a vessel. So vessel strikes are actually predicted to be one of, especially in certain river systems, for instance, the Delaware, and places where there's a lot of ship traffic. And there is even some evidence in the Gulf of Maine of ship strikes, which can be as obviously a source of mortality. So that I'm going to say all that, and somebody even put it in the chat, and somebody asked it previously, what about natural predators? So I will talk about natural predators, but what I will say is that they're not considered the main threat to the species necessarily. Here is one of the main predators besides humans, which I started out with, are seals. So this is a seal, and this is actually a white sturgeon, but we've seen evidence in the Gulf of Maine of gray seals eating sturgeon. So seals are definitely, and as seal population numbers are changing, there's an interesting interaction there to be talked about. So that is a natural predator for sturgeon. Another question that came up, I think, by several people is, how can we help? And I show a picture here on the right-hand side. This is a picture I saw on Facebook. Some of you might know Don Dunbar, very famous photographer down east. He took a picture and said, I don't know what this is, and what do I do about it? And so I happened to see it, and fortunately we were able to pick up this sturgeon and gather it for biological reasons. I am not able to tell you about all the research we've been doing, but one of the things we have been doing with the scoots that you see here is using them to age the sturgeon. So I have not talked about age at all because it's really tricky for sturgeon. We do have some information on age, but the more we can get salvaged carcasses like this, it's going to help us piece some of the things together about sturgeon. And sometimes these carcasses, when they're found, we can determine whether or not they're related to ship strike or vessel strike. That can give us an indication of where do we need to be thinking about vessel interactions. And finally, I will point out, and I know that this will be available to you later, but you may want to write down at least the phone number. So, because if you do find a sturgeon, there is a way of getting it to NOAA. If you call this number, they will kind of guide you through what to do next. If you can get the sturgeon yourself, that's fine, but they might connect you with someone who might come and collect it and help us kind of piece together some of the threats to the species. So I'm going to end on that and just show you a couple of pictures and give you my contact information. This will be up there. Feel free to contact me if you have further questions about sturgeon. I will just also acknowledge the great and fantastic students and colleagues that I have that have been helpful in kind of piecing all of this work together. And then I only have 5 minutes, but I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Gayle. We do have some questions, and so I'll read out some that came in from the chat and some that we got earlier. One was, what do sturgeon eat? Yeah, so we've done a little bit of work on that. One of the things I don't have, you can almost see it in this picture, but they are a bottom-oriented fish, and so the mouth actually projects out from underneath, which you can kind of see there. So they work through the mud, and they tend to be in kind of muddy areas and eat the invertebrates that are there. So there's some indication that they're selective. In the Penobscot, we've found, and the way we do this is we actually pump their stomachs, like you might hear of people getting their stomachs pumped, but we get them to regurgitate what's in their stomach, and we've found that they are eating polychaete worms. So there's, and in the Kennebec River, we see invertebrates also in different parts of the river. Some people have shown they're eating some mussels. Interestingly, in the Saco River, the Atlantic sturgeon, James Sulikowski did some work on that, and he saw them eating silver sides. So there's some variety in what they eat, but they do tend to be bottom oriented. And we have done a little bit of work looking at what are the difference of the fauna populations in the Kennebec and the Penobscot. There are some differences, and we've been looking at that relative to their diet and their condition. Thank you. We did have a question about if sturgeon are farmed for their roe or fillets and where that's happening.
Yeah, so there's actually a place in Canada, and they're in the Pacific Northwest. There are some places. So for on the East Coast, I'm trying to think if there's a place. There was a place in Georgia where some of that was being done, but it's super hard. So to hold a fish that large and to keep it fed, to get to the age it needs to produce the roe, some of the sturgeon species, it's hard to get them to express. You actually have to, if you want to keep them alive to continue to produce roe, you have to open them up surgically, some of them, and some of them you can get them to express it. So it's definitely a hit or miss and a difficult process, I'd say. So it does happen, but there aren't a ton of places that do it.
Thank you. Do you know how the population is changing? Is it decreasing, or are they recovering?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in the Kennebec in particular, we don't have specific population numbers, but people have been seeing them more and more. The fact that we're finding more in the Penobscot is somewhat of an indication to, and the ones in the Penobscot seem to be connected to the Kennebec in some way. We've been exploring or thinking about the possibility that what we're seeing in the Penobscot is kind of a spillover from the Kennebec, and that perhaps there's a high numbers in the Kennebec causing individuals to kind of explore other other places. So the numbers seem to be increasing, but we don't have the real solid scientific data to back that up. So even in the Penobscot, we've been looking at the population for over a decade, but our numbers, like, even I could show you over time what that looks like, but statistically it's not different, but it's giving a sense of a trend to be increasing. So as I mentioned, getting a population estimate for these species is pretty difficult, especially if you want to be able to say that where that trend is headed. I mean, we're nowhere near where these species were in the turn of the century. And that's also indicated by the size of the individuals. So historically, the Atlantics and short-nosed, or Atlantics in particular, were expected to be much larger. And I know I teased you on the age thing, but a lot of the ages that we are finding for the individuals we've aged are more teenagers than they are 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s that we'd like to see. So that gives us an indication that the population is kind of on that young side of things. And so to see a trend to have increasing populations would, we need to kind of move that structure of the population to get into that healthy range of a full range of ages.
We had a couple questions related to jumping. One was, how high do they jump? And another was if they can see where they're going when they're jumping.
Oh my, yeah. So actually take a look at this picture. Their eyesight isn't great. So they have very small eyes. They don't tend to use that even when they're like feeding. That's actually, if you look at that picture, also is a great thing to see is the barbels hanging down, which are used for sensing along the bottom. So they use other senses a lot more than their vision. So my guess would be they're probably not using vision when they're out of the water in particular, because that's also a different, different medium that they're looking through. Then their eyes are probably more adapted for the water. How high do they jump? I've seen them jump for various different distances. So like the picture, let's see if I can go. That picture there, I think that was taken on the Kennebec. They can be pretty high off the water, but I don't know that anybody's really measured it. I will say, and I think somebody put it in the chat, and somebody even put it in the comments that they jump onto boats. They can end up in a boat. They can end up hitting people. So they jump pretty high if they're getting into boats. So I guess that's the only good example I can kind of speak to.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions about pollution and both chemicals and plastic pollution. Is that an issue for sturgeon?
Yeah, so certainly when the Kennebec, there were times when the Kennebec and the Penobscot were in much worse shape before the Clean Water Act, for example. People are studying sturgeon on and off, so it's also hard to say for sure where all these things, but certainly water quality is an issue for any of these species. So I think with the advancement of the Clean Water Act, we probably saw some positives for the species. In terms of plastic, we have caught individuals that have, the classic ring from bottles or whatever around, or gaskets around their gills that we end up taking off. So there's certainly some impact there.
We had, let's see, some questions about specific locations. I'll just list off a couple of them, but one was about if you're seeing them in Brunswick and Topsom, kind of up near the dam there, are those likely to be short-nosed or Atlantic sturgeon?
I think that it could be either. If they're really large, they're an Atlantic, but I think that I believe that part of the Androscoggin, there's historic, or it's been documented as a spawning location, I think, for both species. So it could be either one.
Cool. Have they been studied in either the sheepscot or the damascata?
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody's tried to capture them there, but we've put those receivers that I talked about in both of those river systems, and the tags that we're putting into other river systems are showing up in those rivers. So they're certainly there. On the damascata, there's been some observations of them showing up. Somebody help me here, at the alewife ladder, at the bottom of the ladder during the winter. So that's kind of an interesting find. And so we are finding them in a lot of places we may not have expected them previously.
Just a couple more questions, if you don't mind. We had one about Robin Hood Cove in Georgetown. There was a question whether that area, whether it's short-nosed or long-nosed sturgeon, or short-nosed or Atlantic sturgeon.
Yeah, it's super hard to say. Well, okay, time of year. Is there a time of year? Because typically Atlantic sturgeon, if it's in the winter, it would be more likely a short nose, because short nose stay in the river systems in the winter, whereas Atlantics will go out to the ocean in the winter. So if it's in the winter and you're seeing sturgeon, but I don't tend to see sturgeon jumping. If it's a jumping event, I don't tend to see them jumping in the winter. Actually, if anybody do people see them jumping in the winter? That would be, I'd love to see that.
I don't think we've seen anyone mention jumping in the winter. I think it was people, a number of the questions I think were related to fishing. So like fishing in Robin Hood Cove, if they're seeing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. I would love to hear from folks. I know I was fishing for shad in Waterville, and a person somebody mentioned that I worked on sturgeon, and a person said, oh gee, we have a picture of a sturgeon that we caught like last week, and they showed it to me, and it was a small sturgeon. So we don't know a lot about the juveniles, where they are in the different river systems. You'll notice I talked to you about larger individuals. In the Penobscot, the reason for that is we're restricted in what size gill nets we can use because of salmon. So we have to try to avoid catching salmon. So we're using larger mesh nets so that we don't catch salmon, but we can catch sturgeon, which means we're not catching the smaller individuals. So we don't know a lot about where the smaller individuals are, but if people are catching them, like that's another way I would love to hear from people to know like where the smaller individuals are being found. And that the person that showed me that picture, it was a small individual, and I think that was fascinating.
We had a question about if sturgeon are able to access most of their historic range, and if river systems, if they still have the conditions that allow sturgeon to live in them.
I think I followed what you said, but so the historic range in the Penobscot is the Milford Dam, because there's a natural fall line there. And so right now, with the removal of the dams that were below there, they are now accessing their full historic habitat. In the Kennebec, with the Edwards Dam removal, much of their historic habitat has been restored, but there's still more potentially. I'm actually not familiar with the fall line in the Kennebec, but it may be beyond, I would think it's beyond Waterville. I guess I saw in the chat, if sturgeon are jumping to fill their swim bladders, wouldn't they have to jump all year long? So that's an interesting question. I didn't get to talk about wintering behavior. So for in the river, short-nosed sturgeon, they tend, and I showed that one picture and I quickly went by it and I said, we use video cameras underwater to understand population dynamics as well. But in the winter, when short-nosed sturgeon go up into fresh water, they kind of stage for the spring to go to spawn, but they all aggregate together. They kind of slow down. And so they're not, so they probably get whatever, buoyancy they need to be on the bottom, and they're not really moving around much to need to adjust their swim bladder. So they're unlikely to be, they're kind of in a state of just waiting for the spring to come back. So they probably aren't jumping in the winter, but I like I said, I wouldn't discount it in different parts if there are different wintering habitats that we're missing.
I did have two people ask. One mentioned that they were seeing less activity last year around Gardner, and another mentioned that the last few years in the New Meadows, they've been seeing slightly fewer than in the past few years. Have you seen any of that in your numbers or your monitoring?
Not necessarily. But did you say that that's jumping frequency? Is that?
I think it's jumping.
Yeah, I haven't necessarily, but that's interesting. An interesting observation. Like keeping track of stuff like that would be fun citizen science project to do. Sounds like a good KELT project.
We're looking for more projects. So we'll have to talk about that.
So in the chat asked about stalking. That is not a strategy in the Gulf of Maine. It's been tried in the southern part of the range. And I guess I didn't mention the range for short-nose and Atlantic. Short-nose extend from the St. John River in Canada to the St. John's River in Florida. So that's short-nose. Atlantics are into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's a subspecies in the Gulf of Mexico, and then range all the way to the St. Lawrence River. So the Atlantics have a larger range. And in the southeast, there had been some attempts to do some stalking, which weren't incredibly successful. So it hasn't been picked up as a possible management strategy for the species.
There was a question, I think, earlier that came in related to the Endangered Species Act and what would happen with these populations for them to be delisted.
Yeah. So I guess some of the nuances there. So short-nosed sturgeon are listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. They're kind of one of the poster childs of this Endangered Species Act. They were listed before the list was a list. So they actually, there's a recovery plan for them, but then the certain population levels need to be met and it has to be in all the river systems that are part of their range. And for Atlantic sturgeon, they're listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in the Gulf of Maine. But in other parts of their range, south of Maine, south of the Gulf of Maine, they're listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So similarly, there are targets for every one of the kind of regions where we find different subgroups. So genetically, that there are folks looking at the connections between the different regions for Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon. So there are definitely certain goals to be reached, but again, the population numbers are low and there aren't a ton of people studying them. So you actually have to have a consistent and a good study, whether it be whoever's studying them from the state level to different scientists at universities or wherever, to have a consistent track of these trends. And that's not the case in every part of their range. So it's a big effort to be able to maintain such monitoring for the populations as well.
The last couple questions are Well, there was one related to warming waters. Does that impact their survival or migration?
Yeah, so we've definitely been seeing, it'll change when they're coming in and out of the river systems, and how that affects them overall is still a question. There's been some questions about how much will estuarine habitats be constricted. So I talked a little bit about on the Penobscot with the historic habitat being opened up. One of the things I didn't mention to you is that we haven't seen spawning of sturgeon in the Penobscot. We only have documented spawning of both species in the Kennebec, so, and not in the Penobscot. And we think that part of that reason is the juveniles need a certain amount of fresh water to actually be successful. And for the Penobscot, before the dams were removed, they're kind of on the edge of the amount of freshwater habitat that was available to them to be successful in spawning. So now that they have their full historic habitat, there's some hope that potentially they'll start spawning in the Penobscot. So the question then becomes, with warming climate, how much is that estuarine area still going to change? So there's like a link to the availability of freshwater habitat and temperatures that are adequate for juveniles to survive in these different river systems.
Ruth, maybe one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Yep, so our last questions are, what can be done to improve habitat, or what can fishermen do to help support sturgeon survival?
Yeah, so the habitat issue definitely, running up against the dams is an issue for sturgeon. Or knowing what river systems they're going into. So in terms of, depending on if it's recreational fishermen, if you're seeing sturgeon in different river systems that I didn't mention, and bringing that up to different folks, myself or DMR or KELT, to help us understand that a little bit more would be good. I guess in terms of habitat, I feel like there's a lot that's happening there, but just, noticing and being aware of the issues that are associated with things like plastic and the other things that have been brought up is probably a good way to go. Definitely this whole idea of vessel strike. So as I mentioned, we have some indication that it's potentially an issue in the Gulf of Maine, but have very little evidence. So, and I know it sounds pretty disgusting to think about those carcasses, but they are a piece of the puzzle that's going to help us put things together and see it when a sturgeon is struck, like if it's at the surface and people know that. I know a lot of people, when they know that it's an endangered species, I mean, you shouldn't be taking it or whatever, but if it can be on shore and you can call the right people, no one is going to hold that against anyone, but because the more that we can find out about this, the better. So I guess I should have said from the beginning, if you catch one, you should put it back in the water because it is an endangered species. We're not supposed to be targeting them for fishing. But that said, like taking down the fact that you caught it in a certain location is a good idea.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate you speaking tonight. This was wonderful.
Yes.
Well, I thank you all for hanging out with me for so long.
No, this was great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Just a reminder, I will be emailing everyone with a link to tonight's recording. And I'll include additional resources that Gayle talked about, along with that NOAA number and her contact information. So if you do come across a really interesting sighting, you'll be able to reach out and tell the appropriate folks. So thanks so much for coming tonight. Be sure to check out our website for upcoming lectures and enjoy the rest of your evening.
If you're interested in citizen science, let us know.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.